The young woman lay barely conscious on the bed. The man sitting beside her was already the 10th customer she had been forced to receive that day. Through tears, she begged him to spare her. She could no longer endure the suffering, but instead of showing mercy, the man injected her with a sedative, forcing her to continue working against her will. This place was the largest criminal trafficking operation in the Balkan region of Bosnia. The girls held captive here had been abducted from cities across the country. Just when you think these criminals couldn't possibly be any more ruthless, they reveal the true scale of their operation. As long as the girls remained healthy, they were treated as merchandise and offered to paying customers. The moment they became sick or seriously injured, they were taken away and sold on the black market for their organs. In the late 20th century, the Balkans had become a living nightmare. War consumed the region, and ordinary civilians were trapped in unimaginable suffering. An armed militia seized control of a border town. They stormed into civilian homes, opening fire on unarmed residents and abducting large numbers of young women. Sally, a deaf and mute girl, was hidden inside a wardrobe by her mother, who desperately believed it would keep her daughter safe. But the soldiers quickly searched the second floor and discovered Sally hiding inside. They dragged her out by force. Outside, the battlefield had already descended into chaos. The land was consumed by violence and bloodshed. The armed group showed no mercy. They looted homes, destroyed everything in their path, and terrorized anyone who stood before them. The entire town had become a living hell. Sally watched helplessly as her mother was killed before her eyes. Unable to speak, she struggled desperately, crying out in silence, but she was powerless to resist. In the end, she too was taken away and transported to a place that would become another kind of nightmare. Sadly, Sally's fate was far from unique. The truck carrying her was packed with countless other young women who had also been abducted. Their lives were about to change forever, as they were thrown into an endless abyss of darkness. Every girl brought to this place was locked inside a small, dark, run-down cell. The captors ordered them to stand in a straight line. Waiting before them was the man in charge of the compound, Victor. Whenever new captives arrived, Victor made sure they all received the same unforgettable lesson. Without saying another word, he signaled one of his men to drag a young woman in front of him. Victor slowly drew a sharp knife. Then, right before everyone's eyes, he brutally killed the girl. It wasn't done out of anger. It was meant as a warning, a display of absolute power designed to crush any thought of resistance. Afterward, several of the girls were taken away to different rooms to begin their forced labor. Only Sally was left behind, but Victor hadn't spared her out of compassion. A large red birthmark covered part of her face, making her less valuable to the operation. Her inability to hear or speak, however, made her useful in another way, so Sally was assigned to the compound support work. She was ordered to administer sedatives to the captive girls, help cover their injuries with makeup, deliver meals, clean the rooms, and perform whatever chores she was given. Day after day, she worked in silence, carrying buckets of water through the endless hallways. She watched countless girls reduced to the brink of death. Although Sally couldn't hear their cries, she could see the emptiness in their eyes and understand the overwhelming despair that had consumed them all. Day after day, Sally watched the girls around her suffer unimaginable abuse before dying one after another. After witnessing so much loss and human misery, her heart slowly grew numb. Like a walking shell, she drifted from room to room, allowing endless suffering to consume what little remained of her spirit. She believed this empty existence would continue until the day she died. Until one day, a new captive named Nina arrived at the camp. Like Sally, Nina knew sign language. For Sally, who had endured endless loneliness inside the darkness of captivity, having someone she could finally communicate with felt like the only light left in hell. From that day forward, whenever Sally had a spare moment, she would visit Nina, and the two would spend time talking together. Sally was small and slender, small enough to squeeze through the narrow ventilation ducts hidden inside the walls. Every quiet night, she would crawl through the vents to secretly visit Nina. The two young women, both trapped by cruel fate, comforted one another and gave each other the strength to keep going. Together, they made a promise. One day, they would find the right opportunity and escape this place together. But the camp was heavily guarded. Danger waited around every corner. Escaping was almost impossible, and the hope of surviving was painfully small. Not long after they met, tragedy finally caught up with Nina. One day, she was forced to entertain a high-ranking military officer. When Sally rushed into the room, The bedsheets had already been soaked with fresh blood. Nina lay motionless on the bed, barely alive, her breathing weak and fading. The doctor who accompanied the officer deliberately downplayed her condition. He claimed that Nina had suffered nothing more than minor injuries and would recover after a few days of rest. But when he spoke to Victor alone, he revealed the truth. Nina's pelvis had been severely shattered. Without specialized surgery, she would not survive another week. To the cold-hearted Victor, these girls had never been human beings. They were nothing more than disposable tools for making money. He showed no concern for Nina's life. He simply ordered the doctor to stop the bleeding and leave her to die. That evening, Victor summoned Sally to his office alone, hoping to secure her loyalty. He pretended to make generous promises. He claimed that one day, he would personally take her away from this place. Then he handed Sally a key. He told her it was a master key, one that could unlock every door in the camp, including the main gate leading outside. But Sally knew better. Victor had always been selfish and deceitful. His sudden kindness only meant he still had a use for her. Not long afterward, another group of high-ranking military officers was scheduled to arrive. Determined to squeeze the last bit of value from Nina, Victor remained completely unmoved. No matter how desperately Sally pleaded, he ordered her to inject Nina with painkillers, forcing her to endure one final client. Looking at her dying friend, Sally finally accepted the truth. Their promise to escape together would never come true. With that realization, she ignored Victor's orders. Instead of injecting the medication, she secretly hid the syringe. Among the officers arriving that day was James, one of the men responsible for massacring Sally's hometown and murdering her mother. Terrified that James might recognize her, Sally hurried into hiding, but her brief attempt to stay out of sight left the critically injured Nina to face another nightmare alone. Nina's body was already covered with injuries. Through tears, she begged James to spare her. He showed no mercy. Instead, he closed the door behind him and wedged a heavy wooden beam against it, making sure no one would interrupt him. What James never realized was that he had just sealed his own fate. Inside the ventilation duct above, Sally watched everything, desperate to save Nina. She quietly returned to her room. From beneath her mattress, she retrieved a knife she had hidden long ago. To save her friend, to avenge her mother, she made her decision. James had to die. Moments later, Sally crawled silently back through the ventilation shaft. She saw James continuing his assault. The fear, the grief, and the rage she had buried for so long finally erupted. Carefully, she loosened the screws holding the vent cover in place. Then, while James remained completely unaware, she drove the knife deep into his lower back. The sudden pain sent him crashing to the floor. Knowing she had only seconds, Sally struck again until he stopped moving. James's screams echoed throughout the building. The soldiers outside immediately rushed toward the room, but the door remained blocked by the wooden beam, preventing them from forcing it open. At last, Goran kicked the door open. By then, Sally had already disappeared. James lay dead on the floor, enraged by the loss of one of his trusted men. Goran shouted for Victor. When Victor arrived, even he appeared stunned by the scene before him. Then Goran noticed a faint sound coming from inside the ventilation duct. He immediately realized the killer had escaped through the vents. In the entire camp, only Sally was small enough to fit inside them. Hearing movement overhead, Goran ripped away the metal grate, but Sally had already crawled to the other side. He demanded to know where she had gone, his voice filled with threats. Victor, however, was no man to be intimidated. He calmly replied that he had no idea where Sally was. Goran drew his pistol in an attempt to intimidate him, but instead of backing down, Victor's anger flared. He reached for his own sidearm, ready to return fire if necessary. Meanwhile, Goran remained obsessed with finding Sally. He immediately ordered his men to guard every ventilation exit and search the entire camp until the girl was found. Hiding inside the narrow ventilation duct, Sally was overwhelmed with fear. She knew that if she was captured by the traffickers, there would be no chance of survival. In her panic, she suddenly remembered the so-called master key Victor had given her earlier, claiming it could open every door in the camp. Taking a desperate gamble, she tried to use the key to unlock the main gate while the men outside were arguing, but it was all a lie. The key did nothing at all. With no other choice, she retreated back into the ventilation system. However, her movements were eventually noticed by Goran. Fortunately, Sally was small and slender enough to move freely through the tight ducts. She quickly used the system to slip away, but the moment she climbed out from the other end, she barely had time to react before a trafficker was already waiting at the exit. With her cover gone, Sally was in immediate danger. The man grabbed her by the neck, trying to strangle her, but what he didn't expect was that Sally was carrying a vial of sedative, a drug originally used by the traffickers themselves to control the girls. Now, she used it as a weapon to escape the soldiers chasing her. Sally tore open another grate and dove back into the ducts, but Goran caught up and grabbed her leg tightly from behind. No matter how desperately she struggled, he refused to let go. He even ordered one of his men to hand him a machete, intending to cut her leg off on the spot. Sally's fierce resistance enraged Goran completely. He kicked open the vent wider and ordered a thin subordinate to crawl inside with a gun to capture her. But the man was too cowardly and inexperienced. Despite aiming his flashlight and weapon for a long time, he failed to hit Sally even once. In the chaos of pursuit, he even dropped his gun onto the duct floor. Sally seized the opportunity, picked up a brick, and smashed it into the man's head. Seeing his men fail repeatedly, Goran finally lost patience. He began throwing tear gas canisters into the ventilation system, trying to force Sally out with choking smoke, but he never expected the thick smoke actually became Sally's cover for escape. Using the confusion, she crawled rapidly through the ducts, leapt out from a higher level, and dropped to the ground below. The loud impact of her landing gave away her position again. Goran immediately led his men in pursuit. They split up and entered the surrounding forest, forming a wide net to trap her. Running blindly through the woods, Sally slipped and fell hard to the ground. When she quickly got back up and looked down, a wave of horror froze her entire body. The forest floor was filled with the cold, lifeless bodies of murdered women. The chilling scene was enough to break anyone's spirit, but she had no time to grieve, because Victor had already caught up. Driven by fear, Sally ran even faster. Victor, however, continued approaching her calmly, pretending to be gentle and trustworthy. Cornered, Sally raised a knife in self-defense. Victor, cunning as ever, spoke to her in soft, manipulative words, claiming he would help her escape if she trusted him. Naive and exhausted, Sally lowered her guard and slowly handed over the knife. The moment she let go, Victor's expression changed instantly. He slapped her hard across the face, then began punching and kicking her violently. At that moment, Goran also arrived on the scene. Seeing Victor alone with Sally, he mistakenly believed Victor had betrayed him and was protecting her. The two men immediately drew their weapons and faced off. In the chaos of their internal conflict, Sally seized the only chance she had left. She stabbed Victor in the foot with a knife. In pain, Victor's gun accidentally went off, and the bullet struck one of Goran's men. Enraged, Goran shot Victor dead on the spot. Amid the chaos, Sally turned and ran with everything she had left. Exhausted beyond her limits, she ran for what felt like an endless distance, until her strength finally gave out and she collapsed to the ground unconscious. Fortunately, she was rescued by a kind-hearted stranger, but when Sally slowly regained consciousness and saw the photo on the table, a chilling realization hit her like ice water. The rescuer who saved her was actually the wife of the brutal soldier James. At that moment, Goran's phone suddenly rang. The woman answered it, and after hearing Goran's words, her gentle expression instantly twisted into something cold and vicious. She grabbed a knife and lunged at Sally without hesitation. A violent struggle broke out. By the time Goran rushed back, the woman was already lying in a pool of blood, consumed by rage. He immediately got into his car and sped off in pursuit. Moments later, he caught up with Sally, who was still fleeing in panic, trying to escape him. She turned and ran into an abandoned factory. The workers inside were all strong and able-bodied, but the moment they saw Goran's brutal and violent presence, they were intimidated by military power. Not a single person stepped forward to help. Sally sensed the danger and immediately ran deeper into the factory. Goran chased closely behind, but at a corner, he suddenly lost sight of her. Only after hearing faint movement inside a wall vent did he realize she had crawled into the ventilation system. It was her most familiar escape route. Blinded by rage, Goran followed her into the narrow duct without hesitation, determined to kill her. but after crawling only a short distance, he immediately regretted it. The deeper he went, the narrower the passage became. At a tight bend, his body became completely wedged inside the duct. He could neither move forward nor backward, trapped in a suffocating metal tunnel. Hearing struggling sounds behind him, Sally, who had been fleeing, turned back. In this desperate situation, the once arrogant Goran finally broke. He lowered his voice and begged Sally to free him, promising that all past conflicts would be forgiven. But Sally, who had survived multiple life and death ordeals, had long seen through his cruelty. She showed him no mercy. Coldly, she stuffed a sock into his mouth to silence him. Then, mimicking the way she once applied makeup to the trafficked girls, she took the blood seeping from his wounds and smeared it across his face. She poured out every ounce of fear, pain, and humiliation she had endured. No matter how desperately he struggled, she never stopped. When she was finished, Sally calmly crawled out of the other end of the duct and stepped into daylight once again. Goran was left trapped alone inside the darkness, to slowly die inside the ventilation system. After escaping the abandoned factory, Sally kept running without stopping. She eventually reached a remote countryside villa. It felt like her last chance at survival. Using her final strength, she collapsed at the doorstep. There, she met a kind-looking elderly woman. The woman gently helped her inside, but the moment the door closed, a strange, unsettling smile appeared on her face. So the question remains, can Sally truly escape this time? Will she finally break free from this nightmare and survive? Or has she simply escaped one hell, only to step into another?